In the summer of 1985, the remains of a prominent doctor were found, dismembered and scattered across the state of Michigan. His ending was just the beginning of the nightmare for his wife and my next guest on Girl, How'd You Do That? Hello and welcome to Girl, How'd You Do That? It's a motivational, inspirational, and informational podcast for women. I'm your host and creator, Heather Campese. How you doing out there today? I hope you're well. It's finally a rainy and overcast day here in Florida, which is really perfect weather to settle in and enjoy a great podcast. And have I got a story for you? So I want to start off first by saying, if you have little ears nearby, this is probably a good time to usher them out of the room or put your earbuds in. The subject matter on today's episode is not for kids. So let's get cozy and let's listen in to today's episode. 30 years after her husband's murder, my next guest finally feels ready to share her very personal story of secrets, murder, betrayal, and finding a way to turn all those lemons into lemonade by using her experience to guide others through this harrowing situation. She's a practicing psychologist. She hosts her own podcast addressing murder and advocacy for the survivors. And she's releasing a new book about her experience entitled A Life Divided out this summer. Get ready for a riveting interview with Dr. Jan Canty. Dr. Canty, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Listen, can you take us back to the summer of 1985 and kind of tell the listeners how this whole journey started for you?
Back in July of 1985, it was on the 14th of July specifically, my husband left for work, and that was the last time I saw him. He did not ever return. I was very frantic, of course, because he was very punctual, and the fact that he did not show in the evening really upset me. It was also a very raging storm out that night, I remember. This is, of course, before the internet and a lot of the connections that we have today, so I started phoning around, and to make a long story short, he wasn't anywhere where I could possibly find him. And ultimately, I reported him missing. And because of my in-laws' connections in Detroit, they were able to get the ball rolling really quickly. They knew a lot of people in public service. And a week later, I waited for a week, and I didn't sleep much. And the media was hounding me, and I didn't have any concrete leads of any kind until the police called me down to the homicide division on a Sunday morning, the following Sunday morning, and told me that they believed that my husband had been murdered, but they did not yet have a body. And at that point in history, you always had to have a body before you could consider the person deceased, because of the development of DNA and also other forms of analysis wasn't that developed. And
Right.
And so I was in disbelief, and I found it hard to believe what they were telling me. But basically what they told me was that he had been living this parallel life, this other life, for 18 months prior to that, with these two really unsavory characters in the Cass corridor of Detroit, one of whom was called Dawn Marie Spence, and the other one was John Carl Fry. He also went by the name Lucky. And he'd been giving them money and paying their rent, giving them cars in exchange for having a guaranteed audience so he could go over there and pontificate and be an authority of some kind to them, and ultimately ran out of money, and they ended up killing him as a result.
I can't even imagine. I mean, to lose your spouse is one thing, but then you lost him to homicide, and then plot twist, you find out that he's living a life that you had no clue about.
Right. And it felt really foolish.
So how long did it take you to unravel all the details to where you feel like you had a handle on what the heck he'd been doing?
It was about 2 years.
Okay.
Because the police there was 750 homicides that year, and they did not have time to hold my hand. They wanted to get the case resolved and move on. And there was a lot I didn't know. There was nobody I could ask. And I was, in my mind, just trying to fend off the media and think about my next house payment. And I was in survival mode for a long time. And it wasn't until 2 years afterwards where a reporter from the Detroit News, who then wanted to write a book, interviewed me, and I reluctantly agreed on the advice of my attorney. And my attorney wanted me to cooperate primarily to get information, but secondly, and to make sure whatever was printed was accurate, which at that point in time I didn't care about. I just wanted information. So I put him off for a long time, but ultimately agreed to meeting with him, and he was the one that sat me down and kind of filled me in on all the blanks.
And at any point, did the police initially think you were a suspect? Did they treat you like you might have known something?
No, never.
Okay.
As a matter of fact, I did not know right away, but I was told later they were following me. They're really good at it. I never noticed they were following me because they were not even sure who all it was involved, and they wanted to make sure everybody was apprehended.
So fast forward to, it's taken you 30 years
Right.
to finally decide you're going to put pen to paper and release this book. I think you said in the summer is when you plan on releasing your book,
Right.
A Life Divided.
Right.
Between then and now, what have you been able to do to move forward? What did it take to walk away from all of that, number one? And can you tell the listeners how you were able to turn such a nasty, negative experience into something more positive?
It was gradual, and it was complex. I mean, it wasn't one thing that I did, but I know because of my training as a psychologist, if you look at behavior, you always think in terms of at least I always think in terms of the biopsychosocial model, meaning you want to look at yourself physically, biologically. You also want to look at yourself emotionally or psychologically. And you also want to look at yourself socially and in the community. So with that in mind, I thought, I've got to change those three ingredients in my life in order to get away from this, because it was a pretty horrific thing that I had to go through just to identify him, because he'd been dismembered and they exhumed him from where he had been buried, and I had to identify that in the morgue. It was just horrendous. And that's after he'd been buried a week. So at any rate, I had that to deal with, and I always loved Detroit. I never imagined leaving, but after the press hounded me and after that reporter came to me and kind of filled me in on all the blanks, I thought, it's not going to go away. People kept referring to me as the widow, which really bugged me. And I just thought, I'm tired of being stuck in that category and not being able to redesign my life. And I've got to take the bull by the horns and do it myself. So as much as I loved the new house I had settled into, I was eventually able to sell the house we had. I loved it, but I sold it, and I moved deep into the Midwest in a place nobody heard of me, and changed my name and started teaching rather than doing clinical work, so that I got a breather from dealing with the police and the media and intrusive questions and all of that. And then I got really busy physically, and I started doing triathlons. I started lifting weights, and I got really physically fit. And then I adopted 2 children who were sisters, biological sisters. And the social worker felt we'd be a good fit because their mother was murdered. And they didn't know their father. He was incarcerated and not related to the death. And so they allowed me to adopt these 2 girls, and that was a new lease on life because it made me feel repurposed, I guess you could say, with a bigger cause than myself. And then I started teaching graduate school, and one of the courses I taught was cross-cultural psychotherapy. And I thought to teach that better and to further myself towards healing, I needed to start traveling too. So I started traveling internationally to various distant places around the globe, to people who had much more to deal with than I did. These are people that didn't even have clean water. The women specifically didn't have many rights. And boy, did that put it in perspective when you deal with people that are almost like nomads because they are constantly on the run from danger. I came and I took my daughter with me, my older of the two, because she was kind of turning into a little princess at that point. She was 16, and I thought, I'm not having that. So we lived in a tent over there for 2 weeks, and we built trusses for a girls' school. And she was complaining when she was at home, she didn't want to go to high school and it was too cliquey and this and that. And I was trying to impress upon her, these girls are literally risking their lives to go to school because the chances of them getting eaten by a lion, or lion is pretty strong. And they're discouraged from going to school because they're female, and you're complaining.
Yes.
So
Yes.
so that was a big thing, because when I came home, it really put it in perspective. It's like, yeah, it was bad, but my God, I had the law backing me up. I had food on the table. I had transportation. I had clean water. I had electricity. How much can I really complain?
Right.
And
a degreed professional, so you have a career to fall back on.
Exactly. And so it could have been much worse. So I think between moving, getting myself physically in shape, looking at the bigger picture in terms of traveling to these remote places, I think all three of them, and adopting my children, I think all of that came together and ultimately made me more prepared to come out of my shell and to deal with it more overtly.
Your story is just awe-inspiring, and some of this that you're sharing now, we didn't even discuss on the phone call that I had with you the other day. So I'm just kind of sorry if I'm quiet for a minute because I'm taking it all in. It is an amazing story, and how wonderful that you were able to adopt two girls. So I'm assuming as they grew, there were situations that popped up coming from a mother who'd been murdered, and what perfect person to be there for them, because you knew what that felt like.
I did. They did not know of my circumstance, though. I did not tell them that till they were adults.
Right. And I think you said that you have remarried.
Yes,
and
I
that
have.
He did not know for a while either.
We were still dating, but I finally told him. He, of course, as is natural, you want to find out if you've been married before. And I said yes. And I said, but he died. And I said, I'll tell you more about it when I'm ready, but I'm not ready. And he accepted that. And most people assume it's a car wreck or a heart attack or something, and they let it go at that. And he never was that curious. I asked him many years later why, and he said because it makes him so angry to think somebody hurt me like that. He doesn't even want to go there.
That's fabulous. So you got a good man with him for sure.
He's very protective. But the other thing too is that what helped draw me out of my shell was I was at work one day, and I was listening to a lecture from a physician on something. I don't remember what even the main point of the talk was, but as an aside, as a parallel comment, he made the statement that people who live with a secret for years and years pay a price for that physically. And that really struck me as important, because by now we're talking 30 years that I've been keeping this under wraps. And since I had moved, nobody in that area of the country knew about my past. And then I went back into my office and I was thinking about that. And as I was walking back to my office, a couple people came up to talk to me because coincidentally at that point in history, there was a colleague, a office worker that was missing, and nobody knew where she was. And they were coming up to me and saying, can you imagine what that's like, not knowing where somebody is in your family?
And you're thinking, yeah.
And I'm thinking, hell yeah, I do. But I was like, oh, no, I can't. That would really be awful. And I sat down in my office chair after those two pieces side by side, and I looked over on the shelf of my bookcase, and I happened to have a collection of books all about people who've had a traumatic experience and come through it pretty well. And I started looking at those books over there, and I thought, if those people can talk about it, maybe I can talk about it. And so that I broached the topic to my friend who didn't know anything about it. I had known her for 4 years. And she agreed and encouraged me to write it. So I ultimately did. And with several revisions later, I'm now happy with it.
And so you do go on to kind of advocate and help people that have gone through a similar circumstance of family homicide, correct?
That's the whole point of the podcast,
Yeah.
is to get people to, because there's a natural tendency to put on this mask, and society expects you to do it too, of everything's fine and I'm just going to go forward with my life and not get into it. You don't, it's so exhausting, and it makes you feel so vulnerable to open yourself up to talk about that you just seal it off. That's a very common experience for years.
Well, and I'm a domestic violence survivor from a prior marriage, and I would think it's a very similar, or I'm assuming it's a similar experience. Is there some sort of shame that you go through? I mean, what kind of experiences emotionally does someone go through after finding out that a loved one has been murdered, especially under your circumstances? Did you at all think that, you've had a part in it, or did you feel shame or, embarrassment? Or
I felt a great deal of shame and embarrassment because of the people that he was involved with, and secondly, because I had no awareness that all this money was missing. And here I am, I was a brand new psychologist at the point in time, and people frequently ask you the question, how could you not know? And that question really bugs me, because the implication to me is that they would know, like, you obviously missed something.
right.
And it's not that I was so busy getting my PhD during all of our marriage that I wasn't even home a lot, and so I feel judgment. And then, like I said, the people that he chose to be involved with were really scuzzy people. I mean, she was a prostitute, so that certainly added to the shame. And when I finally saw her in court, I'm like, her? Oh my God, she didn't even look like she'd been close to a bar of soap in 6 months,
Right.
and so but I think in general, people hold back when they have had a loved one die violently, because it makes them feel very vulnerable to talk about it, and they don't want to feel like they are a sideshow. I don't think that applies, by the way, if you're talking homicide survivor to homicide survivor. But to people who've never been through it, I think there's this tendency to feel like you're a sideshow, like a freak show. And people sometimes ask the most inappropriate questions. I interviewed a lady the other day for my podcast, and she said her brother was murdered when she was in her 20s. And she said that she had a couple people in town call her up and ask her how many bullets he took. And
What?
yes, you'd be surprised at some of the things, the liberties that people can take. So,
Well, I guess they just enjoy the salacious detail,
yeah,
not thinking that it's actually impactful to the person that experienced it. This isn't some made for TV Lifetime show. That's her brother.
but they do get that confused. I think the public is numb by all of the violence that we see, and they don't subjectively get a grip on it, and they're fascinated, and they look at it like it's entertainment. I mean, that's what happened at my husband's funeral. I had 300 people there. I didn't even know 200 people, and a lot of them were the media. And they came in with their cameras and their lights and their notepads, and they even didn't try to hide it. It was all over the news.
And I'll be honest with you, I'm really surprised that you haven't been approached to make a movie about it with all the details,
Yeah, no.
I mean, it sounds like something that I've seen on a Saturday night eating ice cream when there's nothing else on, Um, so what kind of tips can you provide family members that might be going through this? And I guess the court phase is a whole other ball of wax,
Oh,
isn't it?
definitely. Especially if you choose to sit through the testimony of the evidence, because it's pretty graphic. And I chose not to go to the trial. I went to the preliminary exam, and that's where I saw what I call thing one and thing two sitting there. But I didn't want to go to the trial because I thought, what's it going to change in my life? He's still going to be dead. I'm still going to be penniless. I don't want to be another opportunity for the media to get their grips on me. The heck with it. And I just left town for that time period. But it is, for many people, a very difficult time, but many feel obligated to go on behalf of the deceased. It's like they're not going to desert them. they have that reaction to it. And one of the biggest myths about going to the trial is that the verdict, if it's a guilty finding, gives you closure. And that's BS. That's not true. It doesn't change anything. It really doesn't. That the closure doesn't come. You're never going to go back to how you were, but you can grow around it, and you can extract strength from it, and you can try to make lemonade out of lemons from it. That's what I think you can do.
Well, and you've made me just think of something that popped into my head. So oftentimes I've seen when it's probably most common when a mother or father loses a child to murder. I've heard more times than I can count of them saying, I want to hear every detail. I want to hear about their last moments. Why? Why do you think that is? Why do they feel that desire? Obviously you didn't.
No, I didn't. But I ended up knowing anyway, because I read the medical examiner report from my book, and it was excruciatingly detailed. But I think parents, I just interviewed somebody the other day for that, and I think it's because they're trying to figure out, how much did my child suffer, and is this and to build their momentum up for their statement to the court, which they now can do. Back in my day, there was no, homicide survivors did not have that right, but they do today. And I think they use it for ammunition when they finally can stand up and talk to the judge about, prior to sentencing, what they think, and secondly at probation hearings later on.
So you're talking about the impact statement? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
So you weren't back then, they didn't do impact statements?
Oh, no. They did not have victims advocates. They did not have special seating arrangements. You had the reporters that came in to review the trials had more rights than the family.
If you had had that right, would you have wanted to do an impact statement?
No, because like I said, for me, it was like, it's not going to change any. I don't care if he gives them both the death sentence, which wasn't even an option in Michigan. But if that had even happened, I wouldn't. It's like, okay, so I still go home to an empty house. I still go home to bills. I still go home to the questions that I want answers to from him that I'll never hear. It doesn't change anything.
On the, when I've gone through troubling times, that I go through what they call, isn't it called the Kubler-Ross stages of grief? Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Did you go through that? Did you go through that with this process?
I think more or less. I mean, it's not as clear cut. I think leaving helped me get some detachment from it, and then I could start to grieve. But until I left, I couldn't even attend to that because I was so busy treading water. I had so many demands on me simultaneous. I had to deal with his psychology records. I had his patients calling me. I had my patients calling me. I had a house payment I didn't know how I was going to meet. I had the press hounding me. I had no family within 900 miles. I was physically not well because I wasn't eating. I was losing weight. I wasn't sleeping. I was so much in survival mode for those 2 years that nothing, as I kept putting it on the back burner, it's like, one day I'll get to that. One day I'll process it. But I can't do that. It's a luxury right now. Right now, I've got to figure out how I'm going to afford food for next week.
You're listening to my one-on-one interview with Dr. Jan Canty, author of a book out this summer called A Life Divided. You can also listen to Jan's podcast called The Domino Effect of Murder. You can find that on Spotify or on the Mental Health News Radio Network. Now back to the final portion of our interview. So does the doctor who counsels others end up getting counseling herself?
I went under a supervision. I went to my mentor, who had been really, really helpful to me in my postdoctoral fellowship. And he knew, of course, everybody seemed like they knew what happened. And I said to him, I want you to be a second set of eyes on every case I work with, and to tell me if you feel I need to do something that I'm neglecting to do to get myself back together. And he was the one that strongly recommended I go see my physician to get something to help me sleep, because I wasn't, I mean, you can't only go so many days and weeks without sleep before it really gets to you. And he was the one that encouraged me to relocate to a different office. And he was very helpful to me. And I don't know if you want to call that counseling, but it was supervision of my cases. And it was, I trusted him implicitly. And so I'm so glad I did that, because that helped me get control over some parts of my life. Because when the media did all their expose, they really went in depth. I mean, they showed pictures of our house, they showed pictures of our cars, they showed pictures from inside the funeral services, which meant that I no longer had any control, any boundaries with my patients, because they'd seen all that too. So they complicated my caseload, and I had to deal with that. And I wasn't trained to do that. Even my supervisor of 40 years older than me said, I've never had to deal with this either. It was a learning experience. And, trying to do it on 2 hours of sleep a night, it was exhausting.
Well, I would think too, I just recently went through an experience where my mother has been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. Okay. And that's my wheelhouse. I am in the dementia field, or I have been for about 12 years. And so I thought when she first got the diagnosis, oh, no big deal. This is my wheelhouse. I'm the perfect person to take care of a mother with Alzheimer's, and then found out, oh, hell no. No, I'm not. I'm actually the worst person, because I almost know too much.
Mm-hmm.
So do you think your being a psychologist helped you through the situation, or do you think it almost made it more difficult for you to go through?
I think it's both. I think on the one hand, because I'm a psychologist, I had very high expectations for my behavior, and I couldn't get angry. I couldn't retaliate. I had to be ethical. I had to focus on other people. I have these very strongly internalized expectations of myself. And I was never going to let my patients down. I was never going to let my problems enter their sessions and complicate what they were trying to come to me for. And also, on the other hand, though, I think because I'm a psychologist, people thought I could handle it with a breeze, and it gave them more liberty to say some really unkind things, like the fact that he was bludgeoned to death with a baseball bat, and they would say to me things like, "Well, I guess that was a home run." And
what?
Yeah, and I'd look at him like, I can't believe you just said that. No, well, you're a psychologist, you can take it. And I'm like, that doesn't give you the right to say those things to me.
No.
Yeah.
No.
So it was both. But on the other hand, when I started having nightmares and when I lost weight, I understood why. I knew that that's part of the healing, and I had to do it. And there's no shortcut, and it's nothing to be scared of. So in a way, that was helpful. So it was kind of both.
And that brings me to something else with what you just said. So were some people trying to maybe give you condolences that actually were offensive or harmful?
Oh yeah, I had that too. Yeah. Because the one thing nobody said, and what I wanted to hear, was something genuine, like, if I were in your shoes, I would not know how I would feel or cope with this. It must be very complicated, because it's your spouse, and yet he did you wrong. I would have loved it if somebody had been that honest with me, but instead, it was like a Hallmark card. It's like, I'm sure you miss him. And my mother-in-law sent me a happy anniversary card after the trial.
What?
Yes. I'm like, am I living in a Twilight Zone here?
That's a little out of touch.
With a little $25 check to celebrate our would have been 11th anniversary. I know. I just didn't feel like people got it, but I didn't feel like I had any obligation to explain it either.
I'm stunned right now. I can't believe.
Well, that's a second book, I guess, that dealing with that family. But
what I was going to say though, was that kind of normal for his side of the family? Did they seem to be very out of touch and not?
Yes.
Yeah. How did that brings me to another question. How did they respond to this whole thing? Did they seem shocked? Did they try to distance themselves from it? Did they rally around his persona and say how much they missed him, what a great guy? Like, how was their response to all that?
Well, his father was no longer alive, so it was just his mother, and he had no brothers or sisters. And she kept claiming there was a blackmail theory, that it didn't really happen. Yet she would never go to any of the hearings or talk with anybody in court or officially to hear what happened. She didn't want to hear it. No.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
It's crazy. So, all right, let's move on from that then. So let's go fast forward. So obviously things are a lot different these days as far as being able to get DNA and impact statements and all that kind of stuff when someone is murdered. But what kind of, are there resources available now in 2020 for people who are homicide survivors?
Yes, there are more, and there's, it's creeping up. There's getting to be more. One of them, for example, is an excellent book that I would recommend people get if they're ever in that situation. It's called What to Do When the Police Leave. Because at that point in time, you have no idea what to do. And it walks you through it. Step 1, step 2, and it's written by a homicide survivor whose 16-year-old son was murdered his second day on the job. And he had no idea what to do either. And he wrote the book about it. There's also some Facebook groups now, homicide survivor Facebook groups, and that can be good or bad depending upon, it's kind of a guesswork because you don't know what the people are going to say, but at least it's there. There'll be my podcast. There are people that do specialize in grief work now that are not available. And there is some other books out there too, but I don't like to recommend them because when you're first dealt with this, you can't concentrate well enough to read most of the time. Your thoughts are jumbled and your focus is bad. And that's why that's the only book that I do recommend, because it's really cut and dry.
I wonder if there's any type of like support groups, even virtual.
Yes, there can be. And I have a episode coming out on that by a thanatologist. He's a person who specializes in death and grief. And there are people, and she talks in there about the importance of getting someone who's credentialed in that to lead the group. And if it doesn't feel right, to get up and walk out. And it's just like buying a car. You walk into a dealership and they're putting the high pressure on you, or something doesn't feel right. You don't stop buying a car, but you go find a different dealership. It's no different. If that group really doesn't meet your needs and you feel worse after having gone, you find another group. But if you're living in a rural area, or like say right now during the COVID crisis, or you don't have good transportation, or you're elderly, or any number of reasons, that may or may not be an option that's available to you.
Yeah, and you're right about that, because I remember after my domestic violence situation, the women's shelter group where I was living recommended a support group, and I tried going twice, and I just realized that most of the women there, they didn't really want to be independent. They didn't really.
Right.
They just wanted to be. They wanted somebody to feel sorry for them. They wanted to poor me each other, and then they wanted all kinds of free resources, but they didn't really want to have to get up and hustle and take care of themselves. And I thought, well, this isn't the place for me. I felt like I was counseling them, and I was there to get counseled.
My mentor had a name for that. He called it preening your symptoms.
Yes, it's exactly what it was. It was crazy.
Right.
So I noticed when I was reading through your bio and some of the questions that you've answered in previous podcasts, there's something here about the experience of first responders kind of overlapping with the experience of homicide survivors. Can you touch on that for us?
Yeah, that came out of a talk I gave at an international conference in Reno to law enforcement. That was last August, and there was 37 countries represented. And I was the only non-law enforcement on the agenda. And I thought a way of drawing them in was to talk about those parallels. And they were things like, number one, the media totally distorts the reality of your situation, both if you're a homicide survivor or a homicide detective. It's not like CSI. You don't wear tight skirts and high heels to the murder scene. Craziness. And second is that you're living in an environment which tends to me as a psychologist and as a homicide survivor, and them as a law enforcement, you're not typically supported in your immediate environment to deal with the stress of it. And so you internalize it. I mean, just look at the suicide rates of first responders. They're off the charts. And it's just not allowed. You're not allowed to think about that. So I brought up 5 different parallels, and it was well received. I had I was told later nobody left during the 45 minutes of my talk, which I guess is the bar you look for in a conference presentation. But they were surprised, and the reason I wanted them to listen to that is because there's a them and us mentality that goes on between law enforcement and homicide survivors, and I wanted them to see, no, there's some parallels here in our experiences as a way of getting them to think about it.
That's interesting. That's very interesting. And so what is this term media terror?
Media terror is when the media is so exploitive and in your face about it that it hits on all your triggers, and it's re-traumatizing to you.
And so how do you minimize that, or what do you tell victims of homicide how to combat that or deal with it?
I think the single best thing to do is to get a family spokesperson to deal with the media, not to deal with them yourself. And in a court situation now, to get a victim advocate. They didn't have that back in the day, but they do now. And you can find them usually through the prosecuting attorney's office or calling 211 for information in your community to link you up with a victim advocate, and they will be literally by your side throughout the court process. But I think a family spokesman to deal with the media is a way of getting a step removed from it, because they're relentless. And
well, what happened with you? You obviously didn't have. Did you end up having a spokesperson, like a friend or something, or did you just have to navigate it?
My parents ultimately flew into Detroit. They were living in Phoenix, but they ultimately got there. And when they did, my dad said, "I'm going to take care of the front door and the phone. Don't answer the front door and the phone anymore." And so he just kind of volunteered to do that, which I was really thankful for, because I was exhausted. I couldn't deal with it. And he was pretty assertive. But even then, they still showed up at my office.
And for how long? I mean, is that why you finally had to leave Michigan? They just would not stop?
No, they wouldn't stop. And when there was,
even after the trial?
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah.
Oh, because I would think, okay, that's case closed. You know, these people got prosecuted. They're sent to prison. You know, game over. Now there's another murder 2 days later. Aren't they like, I don't know, scavengers? Aren't they going and chasing the next murder, and now you're old news?
Yeah, I would hope so. But I think part of what was going on was because that newspaper reporter that wanted to write the book kept fanning the flames of it, and he'd write updates periodically, or he'd give an update on the process of his manuscript. Or if there was another murder that was in any way parallel what happened to me, they would compare the two in a newspaper article.
Unbelievable.
I know. It's like with 750 murders, they're going to focus on one. That's how and there's people that needed attention, that deserved attention, that were being ignored in the process of trying to get the media to do something about a loved one who had been missing and murdered, and they couldn't get any attention.
Well, unfortunately, it probably wasn't as, salacious in detail.
Right. That's right.
Yeah.
Because the statistics show that if you're a white female and there's a tinge of sexuality to the murder, and if it's a person who's professional, those are the ingredients to be very high profile in terms of the media paying attention.
But and I hate to dip back into the details, but when you and I were talking, it really even wasn't so much about sex, was it? The relationship he had with her. I mean, she was a prostitute, but
right. But that's what the public wanted to know about. And
right.
the drawings that they would accompany these news stories with pointed to that. One of them looked like a XXX poster from Times Square. They just wouldn't let it go. And I think that's just what the public wanted.
If you don't give them enough gory details, they'll just create their own,
I guess.
Unbelievable.
And I think too that a lot of people want to believe that there had to have been a strong sexual element to it, because they don't want to believe that If there's not, then that means that it had to be some other reason. And that means that perhaps it could happen to me too. And I don't want to go there.
Right. Absolutely. And that's another thing. So you use a phrase here called conflicted grief.
Right.
What do you mean by that, and how common is it in scenarios like this?
We don't talk enough about that in our society. Conflicted grief is when you have the usual grief of mourning and loss combined with a mixture of feeling some relief in the grief, that there's some part of you that can kind of exhale. It might be, maybe it might not be exactly this scenario. It might be somebody who, let's say you have a brother who's been into drugs and stealing from the family and getting arrested and putting the parents at risk for the people that they bring into the home, and they steal from the parents, and he finally overdoses. That sister might feel a sense of relief that he's gone, but you can't publicly talk about it. People who have conflicted grief tend to swallow it because it's not allowed, it's taboo. And that makes you feel phony, and it also reinforces that input you get from other people, that if you're not being honest, they're not going to be honest and say, well, he was a real weight on your family, wasn't he? And so that was part of the grief process that I went through too, is privately thinking, oh man, am I glad this chapter's over, I want to get on with my life. But publicly you can't say that.
Right. Interesting. I never would have thought about that. You're right.
No, it's not. It's taboo.
And
you're not supposed to say anything ill of the dead,
right, right. And that brings me to my next and probably my final question. But what are some of the common myths and preconceptions about people who lose someone to homicide?
I think a common one is that the first year is the hardest, and after that you get back to baseline. I think another one is that court gives you closure. Another one is that the law enforcement is going to help you, and in my case it did, but it doesn't always. I think another one is that people will rally around you, and in fact people don't know what to say to you, so they tend to flee and ignore you, and in part maybe you're also pushing them away, but you don't have that. Many people report they don't feel rallied around, especially after the first year when they really need it. If there's one point I want to make clear, it's like the first year you do have support, and there is so much to distract you between the court case and filling out paperwork and selling the house or getting rid of their belongings or all these other things that have to happen. That first year you're kind of on automatic pilot, but after that first anniversary, that's when you really start to sink, and that's usually when support fades. And so that's the time, if you're a friend or loved one of somebody who's had a person die from homicide, that's the point you really want to connect with them and talk about the deceased one and say check in, how are they doing, and make sure that they know that you're still there even after the first year.
Wow, I wouldn't have thought that it would be the 1 year mark, but it does have similarities with really anyone, passing away, losing a loved one. Because I mean, you're right. After they first pass away, everyone hovers around. They're bringing over the casseroles and you got to eat. You got the funeral happens, and then everybody goes back to work in their lives, and you're just supposed to single-handedly get on with it.
Right. And so you put that on yourself then, like, well, I guess that's it. I'm supposed to be back to normal. And you seal it off, and you're not normal, and you're not done. And it just can take its toll on you physically or socially. And in fact, I haven't completed it yet, but I'm doing a 4-part episode on the Pulse nightclub murder to check in on how are people doing after 4 years.
Yeah, boy, that was a horrific. And I'm in the Florida area, so that was really a high profile thing that here. I've got friends that had friends at the Pulse nightclub that night. So it's just what a nightmare, an absolute nightmare. But don't you think too that also is the psychology of women a lot too, that we almost feel we feel uncomfortable saying that we need help like that. We don't want to bother. I guess that's my thing. We don't want to bother anybody. So we just kind of suck it up and go on without asking for help.
And yes, and I think sometimes we don't really know what we need. We really don't. And as I tell people, sometimes there is no words. All you need is somebody to sit with you. And that reminds you that you're not alone, but you can talk if you wish to. There isn't
I love
there
it.
isn't any magic. I guess what I would say, my bottom line is, if this happens to somebody, you got to first get a spokesperson, connect with victims advocates, get yourself to your physician, because if you have pre-existing health ailments, they're going to exacerbate, whether it's high blood pressure or insomnia or bruxism or whatever your medical complaint might be. It's going to get worse. So get in to see your physician, at least make the appointment, get your family spokesperson, get a victim advocate, and delegate. Say, would you take care of taking my dog to the vet? Would you take care of getting my car in to get it serviced? Would you take care of dealing with the media? You've got to get your tribe around you. And most people want to help, but they don't know what to do. And you might not need a 10th casserole.
Exactly. Right. Exactly. How many casseroles can we eat?
Right.
Wow. I love this. And I love that you use that term tribe, because I use that a lot too. I think, I think women are afraid to lean on their tribe, but we don't even hesitate to help out or overextend ourselves for others.
Exactly. Right. And so if people want to help, let them be helpful and tell them what you need, because they really may not know that you don't want to go out in public and take your cat to the vet, but they'll be willing to do it for you. That could take
Right.
or go grocery shopping for you, so you don't have to deal with the public or whatever it might be. And if and you might even just have a close family friend or loved one sit with you and make a list together. Maybe you're so fuzzy thinking at that moment you can't even come up with it, but you sit down together and say, this is my routine normally, this is what I do, this is what I need. And maybe together you can come up with a list, and then together you can come up with, well, Uncle Joe would be perfect to do that, and my daughter would be perfect to do this, and then have somebody help you through that. That would be a tremendous burden off of you. And then to get, again, at some point, to think about professional therapy.
Right.
Particularly if it's a child, particularly if you were injured in the assault yourself, particularly if it's a family member who killed the family member. I mean, it can get really sticky.
And you touch on a lot of these different scenarios in your podcast, don't you?
I do. I was amazed. It even surprised me, the variety of ways that people can get into this situation. And I've talked to people that have lost a child through and I wanted to just recorded yesterday. It was the mother's boyfriend of 5 weeks who killed the little guy. I've talked to a blind artist from Mississippi whose friend was missing. She solved the crime from Mississippi to Panama, where he was killed, and it was a serial murderer. It's amazing the scenarios you just get into. There's no cease. It just never ceases to amaze me, the variety of ways that it can come about. But equally, and I want to say this particularly for your audience, it equally amazes me how resilient these people are that I interview. I am in awe of them. I truly am. They are articulate. They find ways to make something productive come out of it. Like this one guy has Ryan's Run. His son was a marathon runner. Now he has Ryan's Run every year, and his honor and creates funding for scholarships for kids. There's just so many ways that people can say, I'm going to honor my loved one's memory and do something productive about this, whether it's writing a book, whatever it might be. And the people that I talk with tend to be that way.
Well, and I love that. And that's why I was so adamant to get you on the show, because, for lack of a better term, I thought you were our poster girl of the whole reason why I wanted to start this podcast. I can't think of going through anything more traumatic than what you've endured. And you're able to articulate what it was like, and coming out the other side, and kind of reach back and hold the hand of the next people that are going through the similar circumstance. Do you ever, I mean, this is how I try to look at life, but do you ever think to yourself, I've got to find a reason why this happened to me, and maybe this was the reason, is so that I could be an advocate and help others?
Sometimes that crosses my mind. It does, because I don't know of any other psychologist or psychiatrist or social worker. Maybe they're out there, but I don't know of one who's been through it, who's willing to step up and talk about it and help others who've been through it, because it's a whole different thing than learning about it in some class or going to a symposium and then turning around and trying to help somebody. It's not the same. It's like what you were describing with your mother's situation. It's different to subjectively go through it than just to get it in a classroom, But I thought, that is one thing I can do. I can take my knowledge, my firsthand knowledge, and help other people and educate people, because the podcast is an easy way to get information. You don't have to go in your car and go anywhere. You don't have to sit down and read a book. You can just turn it on and listen to it as many times as you need to. And I never know which episode is going to connect with somebody. So I really try to make them quite varied. And in the process, I just feel so, I don't know, I feel honored that they would allow me into their lives at that depth and share it with me. And I'm truly in awe of them. I mean, they're just amazing people. It surely drives home the point that I'm not alone. And I want to also emphasize, I did not do it alone either. I had an amazing detective by the name of Detective Marlis Landeros. She was the first Black female on the Detroit police force. I can't imagine the grief she went through to get to that post. She was amazing. I can't say enough good things about that woman. She literally stood by my side during the identification process. And when I fainted, she caught me. And she was really professional too. She didn't cry. She didn't, hold my hand. She wasn't like a therapist or anything, but boy, I leaned on her. And I talked about her at that IAI conference as well. I wanted people to know that it's okay to go the extra mile, and I will never, ever forget it. And I did not do it alone. I had her, I had my parents, I had a good friend, I had my mentor, and without that group, I don't know that I could have made it. And my parents, I don't want to shortchange them.
Exactly. And that brings me to, I think we're going to wrap things up, but that brings me to my last question. And I know this is a sticking point at some point for you, but so where does forgiveness play into all of this, if it does at all? What's your thought?
My thought is that that's a case-by-case scenario, that some people may feel that's what they need to do to feel whole, to stop the preoccupation, to stop the anger, to move forward. And if they want to do that, I would encourage them to do it. You might want to write it out. You might want to talk it out. You might want to bounce your ideas off somebody. But and there is a whole lot of books out there even on grief and forgiveness and so on. So some people may find that beneficial. They need to get over that hurdle of forgiveness in order to move on. In my case, I did not want to forgive him and never will. And I didn't need it, because I saw a third alternative. There was, you can forgive, you can not forgive, or you can just understand what is and move on. And that's the alternate. That's the third choice I took, was to understand it, read everything I could, the medical report, look at photographs, talk to people who were there, read the court transcripts, et cetera, and get it to the depths of my bones in terms of my understanding. And after that, I was able to move on, and it's worked for me. I don't particularly have a lot of anger. I mean, it's like I'm indifferent. It's like, well, he brought this on himself. He paid the ultimate price. I didn't, and it's tragic, but I'm entitled to my life, and I'm moving forward and not looking back on it, because I've really studied it all I need to study it to understand it. So I don't feel any urge to forgive him. And I also think that when homicide survivors or people who've been through hard times are expected to forgive, it adds an additional burden on them they don't need.
Can I tell you something though? I think it translates to other scenarios as well, because I think as a society, we tend to put that on others, that in order to move on, in order to be a good person, you have to forgive that person for whatever it was they did. That is the step you need, the final piece before you can move on with your life. And I love your way of looking at it, because I agree. Why?
Well, my feeling is, first of all, did they even ask for forgiveness? Al didn't. I wouldn't.
Yeah.
And secondly, once you forgive somebody for something they did, does that wipe the slate clean? And then Maybe they think, oh, I can go out and do it again because I got forgiveness once. I'll get a forgiveness twice.
Right.
I just don't see it's essential. I think if you do it, it's only because, I think the best reason is only because you believe in your heart of hearts it's best for you, not because somebody's expecting you to do it, and not because it's going to make the other person change, but because you really feel like you need it. Then by all means do it. But I don't think anybody outside the situation has any right to tell you what to do or not to do on that topic. They're not involved, and that they should stay out of it.
Yeah, if you haven't walked in my shoes.
Right. That's right. That's right.
Dr. Canty, this has been, it's probably my favorite episode, even though I haven't done that many. You're definitely my favorite episode so far. This has been fantastic. I love it. And I just adore you. I think you're just fantastic. And I've really enjoyed meeting you so much. And thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
You are so welcome. And I appreciate you doing your podcast and lifting other people up because of it.
Thank you. Well, that's it for this episode. I appreciate you tuning in. Join us next week. And please like and follow our page on Facebook. Tell a friend. And as always, stay safe, stay true, and you keep being you, girl. Until we meet again, take care of yourselves out there.